What kind of school is this anyway?
I can handle things, I'm smart!
But have you considered that he might just be that good?
Not this good.
Welcome to the Mr. IQ podcast. Here's your host, Chip Franklin.
Well, the last year has been a difficult one for science. A novel coronavirus appeared in Wuhan, China, and quickly spread around the world, reminiscent of the Spanish flu of 1918, which too killed millions. Here in the U.S., public health officials called for increased hygiene, masks, and social distancing. Well, it never really caught on.
We had a situation where science was distorted and or rejected, and a lot of pressure was put on individuals and organizations to do things that were not directly related to what their best opinion would be vis-a-vis the science. You know, I had pressure put on me, but I resisted it. And I had to do something that was not comfortable, but I did it. And I had to be directly contradicting not only the president, but some of the people around the president who were saying things that just were not consistent with the science.
That's Dr. Anthony Fauci, who, with a new administration, can finally speak to the frustration of trying to implement epidemiological models into public policy. His efforts were stalled and thwarted, and now, according to the CDC, 500,000 Americans are dead. We had a heads up a century ago, but now let's ask that same question. What is a virus? Is it really alive? And how do we ultimately deal with it and defeat it? Joining me is Dr. John Swartzberg, MD, Professor Emeritus, School of Public Health, Division of Infectious Diseases and Vaccinology at UC Berkeley. All right, so Dr. Swartzberg, let's start with the basic. What is a virus, and is it technically alive?
A virus is really a little piece of either RNA or DNA, our genetic code, wrapped up in a capsule. That's essentially what a virus is.
All right, well, let's go back a step then. You said RNA or DNA. We all have seen the helix, the DNA helix, but what exactly is in that? What is DNA? Is it all proteins?
DNA is not all protein, but it's what are called nucleotides. They're little molecules, just 4 different ones that fit together in different ways, like alphabets. And that's what makes up our genes. And RNA is the messenger for the DNA. And RNA is what translates what that message is into something real, like protein, for example. So those are the 2 key fundamentals of life. So the question about are viruses alive is really an interesting one. We can say definitively that viruses came after cells because viruses can't survive without getting inside of a cell and taking over our cellular machinery to reproduce. So in terms of evolution, viruses are actually after cells. But are they really alive? Well, they can replicate. So that would be a criteria for life. On the other hand, they're completely dependent upon other life forms for their replication. So people go back and forth. It's like how many angels on the head of a pin. And we're not going to get any answers to that. But it's really an interesting question.
So when we take, say we took SARS CoV2 and we put it and under a microscope by itself, how long would it be active, or how long? I mean, does it have a? I remember reading about HIV and how it couldn't stay long without a host. If you plucked one and put it on a piece of paper and looked at it, how long would it be alive or whatever?
Right. So we could say, how long would it still be able to get into somebody else and start replicating again?
Sure, because that's, in other words, what you're saying is a virus only exists to do what it does. It doesn't exist in any other form other than to get into cells, right? I mean, you could say, there's many things that we view in life that have multiple purposes, right? They can do multiple things. A virus seems like it was born to do one thing, right? Invade cells?
Well, you could say that, but you could also say, well, what are humans born to do? They're born to have progeny.
Yeah, or get in front of me in traffic. That's another thing humans do. Right? But that's a great point. But let me stop right there, because I think that you just touched on a big philosophical point, and we could talk for hours on this, because I would. But like the what is, and this goes back to Aristotle. What is the function of something, right? And what is it in and of itself, right? A human being, it could, if you cut off my arm, I'd still be a human being, right? I could still, as long as I was alive, as long as I had brain function, and then we can get to the whole point of when does somebody actually die, and what they, if you took a board off a boat and put another board on there and kept doing it, when would it become the new boat and cease to be the old boat? With a virus, when we discovered and started following viruses, did we understand and do we still understand really, where they came from and what is inside them that makes them do what they do?
Yes and no. No, from the perspective that we can't assuredly say exactly where they came from, but yes, in the sense that, well, we know they're little pieces of DNA or RNA, and we know that cells have DNA and RNA in them. So I tilt more towards yes from the perspective that they clearly came from cellular material. And interestingly, we see this phenomenon very frequently, not just with humans and viruses, but with all life forms and viruses. So you could really look at viruses as pieces of cells, that is the RNA or DNA, that are trying to find a new home and to reproduce. And you could actually look at a cell as a container for the DNA and RNA to keep it right where it is and reproducing for that cell. So it really blurs the line between who we are and what everything else is that's, quote, alive. It's really fascinating.
Are viruses helping us in our evolution or thwarting it?
Well, they're certainly thwarting us now with SARS CoV2, but they're certainly critical to our existence. Our DNA is composed of many viruses that have jumped into our DNA over the eons. And some of the pieces of DNA we don't think do anything, but some of those pieces have given us very strong selective advantages. Another way to think about it is we have sort of the powerhouse of our cells are called mitochondria. That's where we can generate energy. We now know with assurance that mitochondria actually was a parasite of our cells a long, long time ago. And our cells sort of kept them because they gave us an advantage. They allowed us to generate much more energy than we could without the mitochondria. So we now live in what we call a symbiotic relationship or a mutualistic relationship. That is, the mitochondria has found a home that it can survive in and divide. And we found a companion that generates more energy for us.
Yeah, I'm a big believer that irony plays such a strong and important part in evolution and of everything, not just of us physically, but of our consciousness and minds, to understand the unintended consequence. So we don't immediately attack things we don't understand because they may have other functions. And the last question on this. Is there something inside a virus that slows it down so it doesn't kill its host? I mean, I can't say it knows that if it kills its host, it can't. It's not self-aware, obviously. Well, who knows? But right, it's a virus. I mean, so why doesn't it just kill us all? Is that us or the virus? Or right?
Right. So think of it this way: if you were a virus and your purpose was to replicate, to produce progeny, what would you want to do to your host to allow the replication to be optimal? Would you want to kill your host immediately? Probably not, because you wouldn't have any cells left. So ideally for you, you'd want to find a way to alter the host to allow you to transmit with greater facility. So let me give some examples. The viruses that cause the common cold, like some of those human coronaviruses that we know about, and other viruses called rhinoviruses, and a few others. They manipulate our body so that our bodies start to sneeze and cough and produce excess mucus. which is a perfect way for the virus to get from inside of me into another host that has no immunity. So let's go back then and think of SARS CoV2. I think a very good argument could be made that over time, this virus is going to evolve towards more benignity. By that I mean, over time, it would be a selective advantage for this virus to not make us terribly ill. It might make us sneeze or cough and our noses run, but there's no real advantage for it to make me so sick that I can't go outside.
Sure.
Because if I can't go outside, that virus can't find a new home. So this is evolution.
Yeah. That's amazing. So what you're implying is that natural selection goes all the way down to the molecule and even further beyond that, right? I mean, that because it obviously doesn't have self-awareness to say, hey, I better take it easy on this guy. I mean, that's what amazes me. And I also think it's what's so hard about explaining evolution to people, because they all want to see some sort of guy. They're not comfortable with the quantum state of a body, right? That's it's right. And so that's what fascinates me about this. All right. So let's keep moving on. Many young people have died from COVID-19, but they would say, well, they were healthy, or they had, some sort of underlying condition. Is it possible that when we say healthy people died, obviously they weren't healthy? That maybe they had some either blood anomaly or something that caused them to be more vulnerable to this? Or is it possible the virus, in some cases, like you said before, we were just talking about, forgets its role and attacks the host regardless of who it is with more viciousness?
I look at this more as the role of the host, and I wouldn't call the host that dies who is otherwise healthy, unhealthy. Here's why. We're all so different, not just from what you can see, how we look different, but at a molecular level, we all are different. We have tremendous variation. And one of the variations we have is that some people will respond more vigorously to the stimulus or the invasion of a virus, of a particular virus, or a bacterium. Think of what the world would be like. Could we survive if we were all the same, homogeneous in terms of our molecular response to outside invaders? No, we couldn't, because it would be like a monoculture of plants, and one organism that can get in and kill plants will kill them all. So we've evolved to have diversity in our species, like every species has. So in some people who are young and otherwise very healthy, their immunologic response to the presence of the virus inside of them may be perfect and be able to just eliminate that virus with facility and not make you very sick. Whereas a small number of people will over-respond with too much of an inflammatory response. Or they may under-respond in one area and over-respond in another. And we would call that unhealthy. Well, maybe if you're attacked by SARS CoV2, but on the other hand, if you're attacked by a different virus, that type of response might be optimal. Back in the 14th century with the Great Plague, that bacterium killed practically everybody it infected. But there were a very small number of people who seemed to handle it. And we now understand a little bit about the genetics of those people. And interestingly, with the AIDS pandemic, fast forward many centuries, there's a suggestion that some of the evolutionary advantage to surviving the plague may play a role in some people tolerating HIV infection better.
Wow.
So we have to be very humble when we think about what we define as healthy and unhealthy. Sure, it's easy to say that somebody who's got diabetes and is obese, or a smoker, or somebody who consumes too much alcohol, these are unhealthy people. Nobody would argue about that. But on a molecular level, we don't really understand very well what healthy and unhealthy is. But clearly, diversity is critical.
It is interesting. I mean, my mother just passed last summer. She was 98 and a half. My father died at 58. Of course, my father was 6'4", 400 pounds and smoked 4 packs of cigarettes a day and a former policeman. My mother, on the other hand, walked and she didn't smoke. All these things that, that would play into it. But obviously, we talk about genes. We always hear that, this person has the genes for longevity. In fact, you and I were talking before the show about my response to the shingles vaccine. And I thought, I'm always thinking positive because I had a kind of a response. I thought, well, that's good. That means my immune system is strong. But according to your, again, looking at it, we don't know how I would respond to SARS CoV2, the virus that is COVID-19. And it is interesting. So I guess as we look at this and, trying to figure out, we talked about viruses. Let's talk about SARS CoV2. I was reading a story about how the embassy in Beijing sent some people down to the Wuhan Virology Institute in 2018 at their request to show what they were doing. And they were talking about the transmissibility of a virus from bats to humans. And the people from Beijing sent a cable back to the United States saying, hey, we need to help these guys. They don't have the equipment or the personnel or knowledge, and they need our help. And we didn't offer it to them. Studying the transmissibility of this jump from animals to humans, opens up a whole quandary of, a whole busload of questions that I need. But at the heart of this, when they study this jump, is this something that happens because of what humans are doing with food and the way that we have, mass processed, meat and dairy and poultry and fowl? Or was this an inevitability that we share this planet with all these animals, that these viruses would jump from them to us?
Yes to both.
Yeah.
Clearly, the way we process food, the way we deliver food, the way we process water and deliver water, can easily spread microorganisms. On the other hand, it's pretty clear that when humans come into contact for the first time with what we call a pathogen or an organism that has the potential to cause us disease, we have no immunologic experience with that organism. And that organism has the possibility then of really finding a host that it can proliferate in. Well, how would that happen? As human beings expand their range on this planet and come into closer contact with other life forms that we haven't really had much contact with, the potential for us encountering an organism in those other life forms that we've never encountered before in our evolution leads to the possibility of a pandemic. And this is what we call spillover. Most species have their own set of pathogens, their own set of microorganisms that benefit us and live on us, and their own set of microorganisms that don't appear to offer benefit or damage. And it's unusual for the species that those organisms that live in one species to jump to another. But occasionally they can. We have dogs and cats in our homes with us.
Yeah.
And there are some diseases we can catch from dogs and cats, but very few. On the other hand, we don't have other primates living in our homes. Or we don't have bats living in our homes.
Right.
We have very little encounter with those animals. And the potential for this spillover to occur with those organisms is much greater.
And we still have wet markets around the world. That hasn't changed. And it seems like after this pandemic, the question will be, can we learn from, a million plus deaths around the world? I mean, when this is all over, who knows how many people have died? We'll never have an accurate number. But I mean, I was reading about these wet markets in Vietnam that are just as bad or maybe even worse than China. And I guess the question is, how do you get that message across this platform on this planet?
Yeah, wet markets are not a good idea.
Explain what a wet market is, if you would.
A wet market really is the ability to go and shop for a live animal, and then you slaughter it. But it's not like you raise animals on your own farm and slaughter those. It's these animals are brought together from diverse parts of this planet into one place. They're crowded together. Their urine and feces are contaminating each other. So the microorganisms in one species will be infecting another species. So you've got this real big mix going on. And the animals that you buy are alive. And so the microorganisms are multiplying within those animals. So it just raises the ante in terms of the possibility of getting infected.
I heard a paleontologist say that the anxiety and stress that they deal with in these cages around animals, and especially things like pigs, they're quite aware that they're going to die. That many of them they show this same anxiety time and time again, and I wonder, obviously I'm a vegetarian, so I mean I don't eat meat because I don't want to eat anything that's a mother or father, right? It's just one of those things that's I've been with me since I was 15. But I don't judge others. But it does. I think about that. I think that these animals must have stress. They must have to deal with these things. And I wonder if that affects their body and, these animals that we eat. I know there's not a lot of evidence to support that, but it seems like it could be.
Well, actually, before I address that, let me just comment a little more on the wet markets.
Okay.
The dilemma with the wet markets is really cultural. These have been going on for eons. This is part of the culture of many parts of our planet. And so this is a perfect example of what science tells us and rubbing up against the culture that has been inculcated in people forever. So that's how I see that problem.
Well, the Spanish flu might have come from Kansas, right? We don't know for sure. Right?
It most likely came from the Midwest, right? Yeah. Did you read John Barry's book, The Great Influenza Pandemic?
No, it's good.
Knowing what a polymath you are, you would really enjoy that. John Barry, Berry, The Great Influenza Pandemic.
Well, I know that when we first, I used to have fears about this, mostly bird flu. I used to worry about it. I read too much. There's a guy named Richard Preston who wrote a book called, Demon in the Freezer. Yeah, scared the hell out of me. And also the Ebola book, too. So I've been reading this stuff that's frightened me for years. One of the things about again, kept in my back of the mind was one of the first questions about viruses is that, they do have seemingly some sort of built-in mechanism to not kill every host. So moving forward, but let me ask you just before we leave the wet market, what was the catalyst that made this particular day, the day that this bat virus jumped somehow into a human?
Well, I'll bet that there was no particular day. My thought is that, and others, of course, have this thought, that this virus has probably jumped to humans many times. But in those circumstances, the humans were a dead end. Maybe the human that got infected from the virus 3 years ago wasn't around other people. Or maybe the human that it jumped to, the virus didn't replicate very well in that particular human being. So it's probably experimented with humans many times until finally it just got it right. And that was probably about 14 or 15 months ago.
Let me give you a little thought experiment. If I sent 1,000 human beings that I had quarantined for maybe say a year into outer space, like a Freeman Dyson kind of thing, where we green the universe with humans, how would their experience after 1,000 years of those humans be different than 1,000 years on Earth? Would they quickly evolve into something very different than we are?
Well, if it was a long time like that, there's a high probability that that last generation of humans from outer space would not have the immune system sufficiently robust against the pathogens that exist at that time. So my guess would be those humans wouldn't do well coming back to the world.
No, I say they never come back.
Oh, they never come back.
They never come back, and they propagate. They populate.
Oh, well, clearly, they would evolve differently. Their immune systems would have different challenges. Their bodies would have different challenges just based upon the gravity that they're in. So pretty quickly, humans would evolve into a very different human being.
I just finished a biography of Louis Pasteur, and it's amazing. I mean, he didn't invent vaccines, but he was a visionary of sorts, right? I mean, it was not just milk, but just his whole. I was like, he did a lot of interesting things, and the early view of vaccinations was remarkable. Just how somebody thought, let's make these cows a little sick, and they won't get a lot sick. It was fascinating.
Attenuation.
What's that?
Attenuation.
Yeah. Well, it is fascinating to me. Let me ask you this. So what's future medicine beginning to look like? Can you, I hate to ask you this, but can you look ahead in 200 years? I mean, I watch these science fiction. I read a lot of science fiction, and it fascinates me how people see these meteoric jumps. These some people call them a Darwin leap. I, on the other hand, think people way underestimate problems and things, and they so they're not ready for them. As we move forward with medicine, are we going to be looking outside our bodies for more help, or inside our bodies for better maintenance?
Both, I think. We'll look outside of our bodies in terms of what we can do from the outside to make our bodies stronger. And we're already, of course, doing that with hip replacements, knee replacements, and so on. And it won't be long before we can replace organs, not from other people, but we can grow organs outside of us and put it inside of us. Somebody has a heart attack. They've destroyed permanently a piece of their heart. We can either replace that piece of their heart from cells that our own cells, we grow them outside of us and put them back in us. So I think we'll be able to do, instead of replacing our hips with titanium, we may be in the future replacing our hips with our own bone and cartilage. So it'll be really interesting to see what we can grow outside of us and how we can do that. Inside of us, I think we're clearly just at the cusp of entering the individualized medicine era. And that is, why tell millions and millions of people that they need to reduce their saturated fat in their diet so that they don't develop atherosclerosis? Why not identify on a genetic level who are those people that can metabolize saturated fat very well and not develop atherosclerosis, hardening of the arteries? Those folks may need to be on a very different diet than you or me, who may not handle saturated fat as well. That's going to go for everything we consume, and that will be very interesting. What about cancer?
What about cancer? What is cancer?
Well, cancer are just our cells that have lost the ability to control their replication on a very simplistic level. But they are us. We look at cancer as something evil, but it's really what's even worse when we think about it. It's our bodies turning against ourselves in terms of just the loss of control.
How long have we had cancer in the human species, do you think?
Probably forever.
Yeah.
I mean, elephants apparently rarely get cancer, but can. So cancer can be, from an evolutionary standpoint, controlled much better than it is in humans. But once we get a pretty good handle on what triggers these cells not to have replicative control, and what allows them to evade our immune system when they are replicating out of control, we'll be able to have a much better handle not only on treating cancer, but we'll have a much better handle on the ability to prevent it. So I can see the future of where you go into your doctor for your annual physical, which probably won't be done anymore in the future. And your doctor will do a genetic screen on you and say that you're at very high risk for a particular malignancy. But don't worry about it, because we can go in and just change that high risk in your genes. Genetic manipulation.
But of course, the problem with genetic manipulation is, again, let's go back to irony, right? What is the unintended consequence of these actions? Is the human body getting stronger or more vulnerable overall?
Probably neither. The human body is going to evolve to respond optimally to the environment that it's in. So, we're certainly not as muscular as we used to be.
I know I'm not.
I know I'm not. But, getting back to what you were saying about genetic manipulation or anything like that, the first image that comes to my mind is Icarus, hubris.
Right.
And I think that that's something that has to, of course, temper every advance that we make. Because certainly right now, we don't know if you manipulate this gene, what long-term effect is that going to have? You gave me a couple hundred years in my thought experiment, and maybe in a couple hundred years we can work some of this out. But science is going to be very interesting for a long, long time.
Well, I'm always rooting for Sisyphus. I think that I've always been a fan of the underdog. Last question for you. Nietzsche, was he right? If it doesn't kill us, doesn't make us stronger?
Certainly from an immunologic perspective, if we don't die from the invasion of another microorganism, like SARS CoV2, we will develop an immune response to it that will likely stand us in good stead if we encounter that organism again. In that sense, if it doesn't kill us, it does make us stronger. On the other hand, look at these people who have long COVID right now. We don't know what that's going to turn out to be, but their bodies have been damaged and weakened, at least many of them. And that's not making us stronger. It's actually making us more vulnerable going into the future. Stronger and weaker is really a human construct. And what it's really doing to us, we often don't understand.
Professor John Swartzberg, MD, Professor Emeritus, School of Public Health, Division of Infectious Disease, UC Berkeley. Thank you so much for being here, sir. Excellent.
Thank you. I'll just say to you that I really enjoy our conversations.
Back at you, sir. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to the Mr. IQ podcast with Chip Franklin. To hear more, go to MrIQ.com or wherever you download your podcasts.